One of the sort of growing ideas is with Green New Deal and so on across the world is this idea that growth and CO2 emissions need to go in, I guess, the opposite, in the same direction, so that we need to, cut GDP and then also cut CO2. Is that the position that you hold?
No. So, GDP it's a not a great metric as far as human welfare is concerned, but it is highly correlated with things we care about,
Yep.
like infant mortality, health outcomes, education, and so on. So, and it's obvious that right now around the world there are billions of people who don't live at the standard of living that you and I do.
No, definitely.
It's undeniable. And it's also undeniable that all of those people want to achieve higher standards of living. So whether you want to use a human development index or GDP or whatever, it's obvious that large parts of the world are going to want to consume more energy, have access to more secure sources of food, have a greater level of equality, both in their country and across different countries. So it seems obvious that whatever we choose to do on climate for the coming decades, economic growth is going to be a priority of politicians worldwide. So I take that as a starting point. I call it in my book, The Climate Fix, I call it an iron law.
Right. GDP will always win.
GDP will always win if you pit emissions reductions against that. Now, the good news is that the world has been decarbonizing. And that's a technical term that means how much CO2 we emit per unit of GDP. We've been going in the right direction. We just want to accelerate that. And if we're going to achieve deep decarbonization, so net zero, pick your target date, the simple math means that we're going to have to replace all of the fossil emitting energy production worldwide with carbon free. And we could talk, there's a whole panoply of technologies that can achieve that, but none of that says you or I or someone in Indonesia or China or sub-Saharan Africa has to accept a lower quality of life. So I actually think that emissions reduction and economic growth are not only perfectly compatible, but they necessarily must be.
Right. I was thinking about this in the run up to this podcast. You got some grad students to look at rates of decarbonisation, and the fastest was Japan, which they reduced by, I think, 5% over 5 years when they offshored their aluminium industry. And I was speaking recently to a professor at Oxford who works in aluminium, and she was saying that we're now approaching enough aluminium in the world that we don't actually need to extract it. We can just recycle it and reuse it, which is the majority of the energy that's used for aluminium is actually in extraction and not in recycling, which is an example of where you have economic growth happening, and then you get to a point where you don't need as much CO2 for the exact same amount of aluminium cans in the world, for example.
Yeah, that's a great example of the dynamic of, there's a combination both of increasing efficiency, so we're learning how to produce outputs better with less inputs and less energy, but also the nature of the global economy has shifted also away from, at first, agriculture, then manufacturing, and now more towards services. But all along the way, it's become less carbon intensive. We still haven't figured out how to do things like petrochemicals or steel, concrete. There are some big areas, and there are some promising technologies on the horizon. But this is the kind of boring, nitty-gritty, wonky stuff that's going to make decarbonization happen. It's not the...
Doesn't make great headlines.
Doesn't make great headlines, and people don't march, for reforming technologies in the petrochemical industry.
Changing the chemical composition of concrete.
Right. That's where the action is going to be if we're going to get to these very low targets.
Yeah, I totally agree. I sort of see it as there's a huge amount of noise in, various things, but the actual action isn't on, even electricity makes such a tiny percentage of the overall energy usage. A lot of it's on steel and, making nitrates for farming and so on. And it's not on, are you vegan or not, or are you, this or not?
Right. And I think and I go through the math in my classes, but if you want to achieve deep decarbonization, it's really on the energy production side.
Right.
We have
Oh,
to take
interesting.
the coal plants, natural gas, oil, petroleum consumption, and switch that out with substitutes. And those could be fossil fuel based, and we capture the carbon and store it. We'll see. I'm not too optimistic in the short term there,
no.
but there's an entire set of technologies that are compatible with powering the modern world that could be deployed to achieve these targets. It's not going to be people choosing to ride a bike rather than ride in a car, or to eat chicken over beef. Don't get me wrong; these can have effects.
They're impactful on the individual level.
They are, and they are impactful for other reasons on the environment. But we're not going to get to deep decarbonization either entirely based on those approaches, or even marginally based on those approaches. If we don't switch out our fuel generation sources, we're not going to do it.
Yeah. So one of the, I guess, there's lots of people that look at the energy production side of it. I know you've done the numbers and you walk through them with your classes and so on. I was amazed about how big they are.
Yeah,
they're huge.
Yeah. So and understanding the scale of the challenge is really essential to coming up with policies that are appropriate to the scale, and in a round number. And I calculated this in my book, and others have calculated it also. But if we want to get to net zero CO2 by 2050, then the world has to replace about a nuclear power plant worth of carbon-free energy every single day between now and then. And then keep doing that, because the world's going to need more energy sources. So that's a big ask. And once you realize that fossil fuel consumption isn't going down, it's still going up. Every year, if you look at deployment rates of carbon-free versus carbon fuel sources, I think there's only been 1 or 2 years in the last 20 years where carbon-free has won that battle. And that was, during the financial crisis, and perhaps this year during COVID. So we're not over that hump, I guess, so to speak. And one thing no one talks about or likes to talk about is how do we decommission the fossil fuel infrastructure? Because almost all of the carbon-free energy we deploy, whether it's solar or wind or nuclear power plants, it's on top of our existing energy infrastructure. It's not replacing.
Yep.
So just do the math, and we've got a ways to go.
Yeah, and to put that in context, the UK has, 1 or 2 currently being built? I think the US has about, it's on the order of tens of nuclear power plants.
The US has about 100 right now, and there's several that are in the pipeline, but I wouldn't expect to see them soon. Nuclear has a very strong political opposition. It has strong regulatory roadblocks to being deployed. On the other hand, China's pressing ahead with nuclear. We see possibilities for nuclear to be deployed across Africa, built by Chinese state enterprises. So I think nuclear has a future. There's some promising technologies like modular nuclear.
Yep.
But really, our energy, if we're going to succeed against climate, it's not going to be by picking a winner. It's going to be by deploying everything we've got where it's appropriate.
So let's take the specific example of nuclear. I'm not sure if you've read Matt Ridley's recent book, How Innovation Works. If
haven't read it.
It's a good read. He specifically looks at nuclear power, and he argues that one of the main reasons that nuclear power hasn't happened is because of overregulation. So you go to develop a nuclear power plant, you have to fully design it. The designs then have to get approved. You can't then change any of the designs in construction, and then it gets built. And the costs are so big that then it's basically more efficient to build a big nuclear power plant instead of building a small one. And he argues that that means that you get no innovation, you get no reductions of cost, and so the costs skyrocket. And then you end up with a situation, where, like the UK, where we're keeping our nuclear power plants for longer and longer and longer. And so those interventions, which were intended to make things safer, might have actually made things less safe and more expensive. Would you come to sort of a similar conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd not having read Matt's book,
that's not
on my list,
specific.
But one person's overregulation is another person's appropriate risk assessment.
Right.
If you're terribly fearful of nuclear power, then making it difficult to innovate and to be deployed, making costs go up, that's a feature, not a flaw. So in our debates over energy, and I say this to people, you have to decide, are you more afraid of nuclear power or more afraid of climate change? Because if you take nuclear off the table, then you're taking one of our biggest potential sources for carbon-free power generation. That's fine, but realize, we have examples in the real world. Let's look at Japan. Let's look at Germany and see what has happened with their electricity production after stopping relying on nuclear. We can look at California in the United States, look at Vermont. The reality is that when you close existing nuclear power plants, they're generally replaced with fossil fuels. And going forward, if you choose to build a nuclear power plant rather than natural gas, then in effect you've eliminated that future stream of carbon dioxide. So I in my book I argue for a stance of what I call technological agnosticism. And I know energy policy is very tribal. People love to
people like to say, oh, I'm a nuclear person, or I'm
a nuclear person, I'm a wind person, I'm a solar person. It's all carbon capture, biofuels. And I just don't think that is particularly productive. It's fine. People can advocate for whatever technologies they like. But if your goal is deep decarbonization, you should really want everything on the table. Because the minute we start taking things off, the job becomes that much more difficult.
No, definitely. And I think what you just said there about like various amounts of risks, I've noticed them, I've observed in myself with the COVID pandemic, where I've realized my tolerance for risk is comparatively low compared to others. And it happens with any debate where people have a breadth of personalities and outlooks and so on. And so there's a lot of noise, but then through that, people end up coming to quite a reasonable position.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I often paraphrase Walter Lippmann, who says that the goal of politics is not to get people to think alike, but to get people who think differently to act alike.
Right.
So it's perfectly understandable and to be expected, really, that people are going to have different risk tolerances, they'll have different fears, they'll champion different causes, but that's just the landscape of politics in any highly contested area. So the idea that we're going to have a silver bullet solution via one technology or another in climate is a little fanciful.